sticking with us. That wasn't bad. 225. Okay, this is the final panel of a very productive and informative day with a lot of challenges given to our panel. On this, we have the Honorable Andrew Natsios, who I remember fondly and well as the administrator of USAID, now the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs and professor at the George H.W. Bush Government School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. Of course, all our thoughts and prayers are with President Bush. Scott Dowell, Deputy Director of Surveillance and Epidemiology at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Dr. Elizabeth Cameron, Vice President for Global Biological Policy and Programs at NTI. This has been a group of witnesses with a humblingly high level of education. Anyway, that's why it's been a productive day. Have you all decided who should go first? If not, Honorable Andrew Natsios, it's good to see you again.
Nice to see you, Senator. Senator, I think we actually met in South, I'm trying to remember, we had dinner somewhere. I think it was in South Africa.
I think that's right.
15 years ago or something.
Yeah,
yes.
I won't ask any more questions.
It's an honor for me to be here today, talk about biological threats and global security. I'd like to address actually 4 areas, but one area Mike Osterholm dealt with in depth, so I'm going to take it out of my remarks, and that's the issue of supply chain management, which it's a hidden issue. He is the one who's been talking about it. We are about to issue a second policy paper in our pandemic policy initiative at the Scowcroft Institute, and we're going to include a whole section on this because that is not being dealt with. It is a huge risk for the United States. And we saw what happened with the hurricane in Puerto Rico, how vulnerable it is. Another vulnerability, when the hurricane came in, was it 2005, 2004, that hit Louisiana, it came within a few miles of the huge USAID food warehouses. And it didn't hit. If it had hit those warehouses, we would have had large-scale starvation in refugee camps and displaced camps around the world. And we were all watching, the whole staff at AID was watching, saying, what if it turns just a few miles and all those warehouses are destroyed? So a lot of our systems are more fragile than we realize in terms of emergency response. The third is the need to increase private sector involvement. That was also discussed. But finally, I want to deal with the issue of organizational dysfunction in management and implementation. You mention, everybody mentions, policy, science, and technology. The fourth component of that is the one we fail at the most, and that is implementation. And in organizational structure and management, it is a boring subject. When I used to bring it up at AID, I said, that's not for us to deal with, but it is. All federal agencies and UN agencies, NGOs have to deal with the same set of issues, and we have not adequately even done research in this area. So in terms of leadership, it should be a top priority, and we have endorsed the recommendations that you have made in terms of centralizing leadership responsibility. I believe in the Vice President's office.
Correct.
We have done the same thing, recognizing your initial recommendation and said that makes a lot of sense. I would recommend that it be done right now in the White House with the Vice President. I think the Ebola epidemic demonstrated that we need several central points at which decisions could be made rapidly, and that time is the greatest enemy of all emergency response, whether it's in a natural disaster, a flood, an earthquake, or a storm, a civil war, or a famine, or an epidemic. Time is of the essence. The longer you the delay, the more people that die. The longer the delay between the time we know it's happening, the time we respond, the less options we have available to us to respond. And ultimately, it increases the level of failure if we take too long in responding. One of the fights that went on in the White House, I'm told by friends of mine in the career service, during Ebola, and this would have happened in the Bush White House or the Trump White House. It doesn't make any difference who's the president. is there was a fight between, and they may not admit this publicly, but my old staff was telling me, and there's a huge food fight over who will lead the response. Will it be DOD, CDC, USAID, State Department, NIH was really not advocating to lead the operational response. I will not say exactly who said what, but I'm told several agencies said, we will not work with X agency. And I said that's a little odd for a federal agency telling the President of the United States that they refuse to work with another federal agency. But the feelings are so intense. The President was saying, well, you know, what is going on here? What is this intense rivalry between agencies that's slowing down the response? And it took 2 months to sort this out. I think he made the right decisions to have the DART team from AID in charge with a deputy from CDC in the DART team, and then DOD agreed voluntarily, which is what usually happens in these emergencies, for DOD to report to the disaster response team, which they're used to working together on natural disasters and man-made. Over 30 years they've been doing this. So they have established procedures that work very well.
So I want to add just parenthetically, going back to that case of not inside but outside, while all this is going on inside the administration, the news networks are focused on every development. You know, once it becomes the story of the day or the week, so it's very clear to the rest of us out here that it's not clear who's actually in charge, and that's not a good feeling.
The first principle.
That's a White House failure. I mean, I would have fired a CDC director that said to me they wouldn't work with another agency that was led. I mean, that's. The president or his chief of staff should have simply said, you guys are going to all work together or we're going to get your resignations.
It does happen fairly often, Dr. Sheila. I have watched it in front of me. Usually, as I was in the Army Reserves, I was retired as a lieutenant colonel, and I have a little part of the military in me. And so when I'm given an order that's very clear, I salute, carry the order out. The Defense Department usually, but not always, is the only federal department, if you give them a direct order in writing and it's very clear they will carry it out. That's one of the only federal agencies that actually does that. And they sometimes resist themselves, even though they won't tell you that. So leadership is very important. Leadership of the United States in the international system counts. In fact, we're seeing now what happens when the United States is not in a leadership role, as it's had been for 70 years. And this has begun to slip even before the Trump administration. The nature of the international order is changing. And we're going to see, I don't know if you remember that movie that was written, that was produced, I think in the early 40s. What happens if this character didn't live in a particular town? It's a very famous movie. Everybody watches it at Christmas time. Donna Reed is in it. Oh, It's a Wonderful Life.
Wonderful Life.
Well,
right.
we are sort of like Jimmy Stewart. I mean, we're going to see what the world looks like without that honorable man in the movie. Because even though we do act in our national interest, we have a side to us that provides leadership when it's not in our parochial interest. It's just in the interest of global leadership. And Republicans and Democrats have been doing that since the end of World War II. And as our power in the international system subsides, we're going to see more ultranationalism by countries around the world. And the consequence of that, in my view, is going to be disastrous. The progress we've made is going to deteriorate. Alex Dowell, who's a scholar, a British scholar, he teaches in Boston, I think at Tufts now, and Alex is an old friend of mine, and he wrote a book called Mass Starvation, and he tracked the number of famine deaths in the last 150 years. He said the only time in history that there's been a substantial drop in the number of people dying of starvation in famines is since 1980. And that is because of both the globalization of the world food system, which is primarily private, but it's also because the emergency response system of the United Nations, the World Food Program, the ICRC, the NGOs, and the aid agencies like AID and DFID and the European Union have developed a system that is very effective in preventing starvation deaths. So he shows dramatic drop, and he says in the book, this is a function of the international, which he used to be very critical of. It's now working. I'm afraid it's going to start deteriorating if we don't pay attention to it. So leadership counts. The second thing that is very important from our perspective is the involvement of private industry, not just the pharmaceutical industry, but all private industry, because all industry that operates in the developing world in particular has to worry about their workforce. Whatever they're doing, whether they're oil companies or mining companies or manufacturing plants, their workforce will be devastated. And many of them have done emergency planning, but they haven't done it in a group. They've done it individually within their own corporations. And they have not been engaged in this with the U.S. government or the international system. And I think that's a weakness that needs to be corrected. We also believe at the Scowcroft Institute, and we will have this in the next policy paper we produce, which is coming out in a few weeks, is that that we need to alter the incentive structure in the private markets to make it profitable for companies to take technology that's already been developed. Science has already done the research. Technology is there. The problem is implementation. It has not been mass produced. Why? These are vaccines. There's the different kinds of drugs that would be extremely useful in the developing world. It's because the market's not there. They're not going to do this just because it's a nice thing to do. And so we need to alter the structure of the markets through, we have an example of this already, what's called Gavi, Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. It was started 18 years ago. It's been very successful, but it's narrow in its focus. It promised the pharmaceutical companies, we know you already have this drug, this vaccine. If you mass produce it, we will guarantee you a market through the NGO community and the aid agencies and the UN. And that's been effective, but it's narrow. We need to take the success stories of Gavi and now expand it. And the final issue is this question of implementation that I mentioned earlier. One thing everybody talks about in the international system and in the US government is the need for more coordination. I tell my students when I taught at Georgetown, if you mention the word coordination, I'm going to throw you out the window. I mean, that's rhetorically, of course, only. Because it doesn't mean anything. The word coordination has so many different definitions, and the bigger problem with it as a word is people don't understand what it means. It means you're going to slow down responses. Coordination is inversely related to speed in emergency operations. The more you coordinate, the slower you are. Why is that? It means you're working with other agencies and other departments that have conflicting missions to what you have, conflicting business systems. They have forces that are trained differently and have a different worldview. If you want to deal with, look at what AID does versus the Pentagon versus HHS or the Treasury Department or State Department. I used to sit on the NSC meetings for a long time watching this conflict of missions that is really not a function of partisan politics or even ideology. It's a function of bureaucratic differences in business systems. So if we want to coordinate, it should be done in terms of preparedness, in terms of making the decisions ahead of time, not in the middle of the emergency, how the system's going to work. But in terms of flipping the switch, it cannot be done centrally. It has to be done at the lowest level, and I'll give you an example of what I mean. I ran the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance almost 30 years ago for President George H.W. Bush. We call him 41 at the Bush School. And that was a little office in AID. Larry Eagleburger's cable after the Skopje earthquake in 1962 or 63 in Macedonia led to the creation of this office. When I started, it had 45 staff and $20 million annual appropriation. Today, it has a $2 billion budget with 700 staff. It's about to be merged with Food for Peace. The total budget between Food for Peace and OFDA will be $4 billion with 1,000 employees in AID, okay? Now, I tracked this for a book I've been writing on what it looks like over 30 years. It's almost a straight line through the Bush administration, the first 41, through the Clinton administration, through the second 43 administration, and through the Obama administration, and it's continuing, even though there were cuts in OMB. The Congress restored all the cuts. It's very bipartisan. Either Senator Helms and Patrick Buchanan, when Buchanan ran for president, she should abolish all aid programs except for the emergency response programs. So even the hard isolationist right says leave those programs alone. So it has broad bipartisan support, which is why it's grown, and the audits and evaluations have shown it's very effective. The utility for this discussion today is it requires 3 positive yeses to mobilize the OFDA team. The director of OFDA, which is way down in the bureaucratic structure, it's not any Senate confirmed position, has to say yes. The ambassador, the U.S. ambassador in the country has to say yes in a cable that's already written. It's written, you just put in the name of the country and the type of disaster. It's sent to Washington, and the country has to say, yes, we need help. All you need is 3 yeses. 3 yeses in order to mobilize this system that's been very effective over the years, and that Alex Dowell has traced in terms of its evolution and its success rates. It's successful because the system can work very simply at the lowest level. If you read the literature on bureaucratic management, James Q. Wilson's famous book, Bureaucracy, which I had until 35 years ago in graduate school, the best responses are those, particularly in management of this kind, that are at the lowest level of implementation, where the officers know operationally what's going on in the field. It's been successful because of simplicity and because of a minimal number of yeses that are required to move forward. The more agencies you have involved, the more yeses that are required. All the implementation literature shows it slows everything down to a crawl. There's a book by Aaron Wildavsky called Implementation. It's nothing to do with pandemics, but the lessons from that book are very, very applicable to the issues we're dealing with from a management standpoint right here. So I have 5 very quick comments in terms of how we should deal with these implementation and management issues. 1, do not reinvent the organizational wheel or the federal agency system. Don't create a new bureaucracy. 2, do not try, in the case of international aid programs or emergency response, to transplant what works well in a Western country automatically assuming that it'll work well in a developing country, because frequently it does not, because of culture, and that's why you need anthropologists and technical experts to tell you whether this system that's worked in the United States is going to work in Nigeria or going to work in Peru. Third, coordination, as I mentioned earlier, is inversely related to speed, particularly when you're dealing with an outbreak of a disease, a pandemic. Fourth, do not confuse emergency response with other organizational biomanagement issues. And I don't know if that term exists, but I made it up, biomanagement. And so doing coordination between agencies before the emergency is very important. That's why we need the vice president's involvement. But once the event takes place, we need to decentralize the decision-making process to the lowest levels and minimize the number of people who have to approve it, or we won't get there in time. And finally, organizations which train together in emergency response are proven by a lot of literature. Both domestic emergency response and international emergency work much better together if they train together. They do simulations together. That's why the Defense Department is constantly training, constantly. 20% of the Defense Department budget is used for training before wars take place. And I would argue if we want to make our system work, it's not enough just to make the organizational decisions. We have to get the units together in the government. They're going to be doing the response after the decisions have made organizationally, and actually have them work the problems together in exercises before the actual event takes place. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come back to some of what you said, Dr. Dowell. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks very much for your opportunity to speak with you all. I'm going to make just one recommendation, and some of what I say will reinforce what Andy just said, maybe not all of it, but I once got a basket of chicken products from the Prime Minister of Thailand, and if you bear with me for just a couple of minutes, I can explain why that's relevant to what we're talking about here. I was actually there, sent by CDC for 4 years to start what became the first global disease detection center. And those were the years, it was 2001 to 2005, so the years of SARS and avian influenza. We dealt with SARS first. It came to Thailand actually in the lungs of a physician named Carlo Urbani, who was a colleague, worked for the WHO in Hanoi, and described some of the first cases. He got sick on the way to Thailand, and I ended up taking him to the hospital and making sure he was cared for safely through about a 3-week period. And during that period, the SARS epidemic evolved quickly across Southeast Asia. If you weren't in Asia at the time, it's hard to appreciate how frightening and uncertain that time was. We really weren't sure which way it was going to go. It ended up he ended up dying, but the virus didn't spread from him. Thailand ended up having 7 SARS cases, so not a large number. And the initial response that was led by the Ministry of Public Health was taken over when it became clear that tourism was being impacted. And so despite the small number of cases, it impacted the economy of Thailand for a limited period of time in a substantial way. Once they got through SARS, avian influenza hit, and this was different. Influenza H5N9 had an even higher mortality in humans than SARS did, and it killed upwards of 50% of the people it infected, but of course it spread mainly in chickens and killed thousands of chickens, and tens of thousands were being culled. So avian influenza had an impact on the agricultural side. We had set up with our Thai colleagues for SARS what was called, they called a war room. We would call it an emergency operations center now. And that war room was activated for avian influenza, but it quickly became apparent that the epidemic was beyond the capabilities of the health department. And so the agriculture was involved, the military got involved in the culling of the birds. Again, transportation, trade, and tourism were impacted. And so the Prime Minister said, we can't have this run by the Ministry of Public Health, and appointed a Deputy Prime Minister to organize it. And I remember the Deputy Prime Minister as a very capable person who did his best to organize the different departments, but he had no experience in managing an epidemic, and also didn't have experience in directing the resources of the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Health or any of these other ministries that he had to direct. And so he did his best to make it up as he went along. And again, the number of human cases of avian influenza was relatively small, and so it worked out okay. So that was the backdrop. I got this call saying, the Prime Minister wants to see you. And I said, really? I wasn't expecting it. So I called the U.S. Embassy and I said, what do I do if the Prime Minister wants to see me? And they said, well, you go. And so I got in the car and went down. You may have been at Government House in Thailand, but it's this set of beautiful little buildings and this green grass. And I got out and they directed me to one of them, and I kind of smoothed down my suit and walked in. There was a security guy sitting there, and I told him, I think I'm supposed to be meeting with the Prime Minister, and he said, over there. And so I walked over to this room the door was cracked open, and sure enough, I could see the Prime Minister, who I recognized from the newspapers, and the Minister of Public Health, and the Deputy Prime Minister, and I assumed all the other ministers having a meeting. So I went in there, and it was myself and Robert Webster as a virologist, influenza virologist, were the foreigners who were there. And we heard some of the discussion over the next 15 or 20 minutes as they finished up their discussion about the avian influenza. And then they had some questions for us about this little cluster we had investigated where it was person-to-person transmission for the first time, and was that going to be a big problem? It turned out it wasn't. Answered their questions and got up and were presented with these baskets of chicken products from Charon Products Farm, as a major agricultural part of Thailand. So I tell you about this rather surreal experience to emphasize the point that Andy made, that the time to invent the response to the epidemic is not during the epidemic. And pandemics are not simply large epidemics. Pandemics, one of the main differences is they by necessity involve lots of sectors beyond health. And what we've seen over and over again, not just in Thailand, but in a number of other countries, certainly at the UN and here, is that when an epidemic threatens to become a pandemic and involves other sectors, the health sector is not able to respond by itself. And the response to that is invented at that time and put together, and people like the Deputy Prime Minister do their best to invent things as they go. So when I reread your blueprint that you sent us in advance of this, the part that jumped out at me, of course, was this part where you recommended that the Vice President be empowered and authorized to lead this. And I don't know, you know better than I, far better than I, about whether it's the Vice President or some other structure that will work best in the US government. But what's clear to me is that in epidemic after epidemic, the procedure of inventing this above the health sector solution during the course of it is not the right way to go. And so if it's possible to figure this out within the US government, that would be tremendously valuable as a model for other governments and for the UN, who stumbled around with, in Ebola, it was UNMIR. There's been a series of these things. So it would be an important contribution, and my recommendation would be to pull that out, reinforce it. Whatever you can do to make that happen, we would be certainly strongly in favor.
Thank you. Did you eat the chicken parts? You don't have to answer the
It
question.
was a beautiful, it was actually a beautiful basket of chicken parts.
Yeah.
I wanted to save it as a souvenir, but you
Yeah.
couldn't. I mean, they were going to go bad.
Incidentally, I should say really briefly that to a certain extent, we saw this problem of a lack of coordination that you both talked about. And then we kind of backed into recommending the Vice President because we couldn't identify anybody else that we thought had the authority to do what had to be done across all the departments, except the President, and that didn't seem appropriate. Dr. Cameron, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so much for inviting me here today, and I'm delighted to be back in front of the panel. When I was last here, I was representing the Obama administration NSC, and so it's nice to be back. So I am with NTI, and NTI, as I think many of you know, was founded by former Senator Sam Nunn and philanthropist Ted Turner in 2001, and actually before September 11th, before the anthrax attacks, before SARS. But it's always included as part of its broader mission, biosecurity. And our current CEO, Ernie Moniz, and Senator Nunn both prioritize this. And so my job is to look at today's threat and to think about what it is that we can do in the non-governmental world to catalyze new programs, new policies, new activities to really to address the new facets of this problem as we find them. And so to that end, since I am the last speaker of the day, I have 4 recommendations. I was sent to do 3, but I always try to overachieve. So I have 4, and I'm not actually going to dwell on challenges because I think you've heard a lot of challenges over the day. I'd agree with many of the challenges that I heard today and have been here for other sessions before. I would like to thank you for focusing on the transnational element of this threat. I'll say that when I first heard about the Blue Ribbon Study Panel, when I was sitting at the NSC, my one concern with the term biodefense is I was very worried it would only focus on domestic issues, and Asha knows this because we spoke at length at that point. And it's great that you've actually managed to integrate those issues throughout all of your panel discussions and throughout the report. And I think it's done a great service in the community by giving a mechanism for different pieces of the community to even come to these meetings and talk to each other. So thank you for that. So I'm not actually going to talk about the Vice President recommendation, although I'm happy to answer questions about it and have in the past. But I'm going to talk a little bit about 4 things that I think we should pay more attention on globally, which relate to health security broadly, and the recommendation, a little bit to the recommendation 33 in your report, but also the biosecurity elements of it. So if you think about health security as a panoply of activities that help countries, including our own, prevent, detect, and respond to biological threats, biosecurity is the piece that focuses on intentional threats, just to shorthand. And so these are important pieces of a spectrum But one of the things that we really wanted to achieve with the global health security agenda was embedding biosecurity into the broader public and animal health response world. Not to say that it shouldn't also be focused on by the security sector, but to actually make sure that it was a key focus for the elements that actually control the laboratories and largely the response until we get to the crisis point anyway. So first and foremost, you've heard a lot about leadership. I'm going to echo that, but I'm going to break it down into a few pieces of leadership. So the U.S. should continue to lead, not only on broad health security, but biosecurity. And I think one way that we can lead is actually about framing. So thinking about our deployed CDC and USAID experts, not only as implementers, which I think is critically important, but also as biodefense assets and framing them that way. They are our deployed biodefense assets, and thinking about them and their budgets in that context as we're looking at the rest of national defense, I think is really continues to be important. So framing it that way, I think is the right thing to do. And to that end, bringing home people who are deployed overseas working on this mission is not a good idea, in my view. And that's something that's been spoken about a lot in the press. And I remain concerned, despite some optimism in the FY18 omnibus for those programs getting some increases, I remain concerned to see people especially from CDC coming back from some of the countries that they've just built up a presence in, because detecting an outbreak at the source and stopping it there is definitely best for the country, and it's certainly best for us too. The second piece of leadership is obviously resources, but not just for state and USAID, which I think we talk about a lot. I'm not for just USAID and CDC, which we talk about a lot when we talk about health and health security, but also the DoD and State Department cooperative threat reduction programs. And I haven't heard them mentioned since I've been here. I don't know if they were mentioned earlier today. But these programs sync up hand in glove with the programs at CDC and AID. And they are roughly, I did a back of the envelope calculation over the summer, they're roughly 2/3 of the world's funding for biosecurity. So those programs are carrying the load for everyone else. And they're not increasing. They're actually, in the case of DoD, they have historically been decreasing as a function of the rest of CTR. And I think that's a problem, because we now have the ability to look at how countries are doing with health security, because we have some metrics that the world's agreed to. And some of those metrics are for biosecurity. And when you look at them and you look at the countries that have been evaluated, 75% of the countries that have published these evaluations either have limited or no biosecurity capability. So that's a problem, and it's something that I'm worried about. I think we also need to make sure that the security elements are part of the discussion about health security. I think that does happen here. We have pretty good coordination. We have some synergy too, in addition to coordination. But around the world, you don't often see ministers of defense or ministers of foreign affairs or their delegates at these meetings. One of the things that we're doing with the Government of Canada, and also with some support from the Open Philanthropy Project, is we're putting together an activity called the Global Biosecurity Dialogue, which is intended to bring senior officials from ministries of foreign affairs, defense, health, and agriculture together to talk about barriers to improving biosecurity, and to make sure that it remains a critical part of the global health security agenda as it moves into the future. So that's number one, leadership, but broken down a few ways. Number two is this element that Terry Taylor spoke about really well earlier today, and that's paying attention to emerging risks, including those that are associated with advances in technology. And I'll echo what you heard from Terry and a number of other people, that we need innovation in technology to get to health security, food security, and environmental security. So that's critical. But it's undeniable that the democratization of this technology is increasing the likelihood that disease threats can be made and modified from scratch. And we know from seeing horsepox published recently, synthesized and published recently, that smallpox can be created from scratch. And that's just what we can imagine today. So while we have had a pretty robust debate in the US and around the world in many governments about this issue, the technical community themselves, I think, we could do a service by bringing them together around emerging risks, and specifically challenging a community of experts to come up with actual international norms surrounding emerging risks posed by advances in technology. This was something that the Fink report, which was published in 2004, actually recommended, and it was never fully implemented, that there should be an actual international forum. And I'm not saying a treaty, because I agree with Terry that by the time you get governments together around these risks, the technology is often superseded whatever or changed whatever you need to do. But I do think there need to be nimble ways for technology experts themselves, as they're creating technology, to think about the risk, and also to challenge them to think about safer and secure technologies. So in the cybersecurity world, we have people who are technology experts who are building, cybersecurity elements. We don't really have a technical biosecurity cadre. We have policy wonks and we have laboratorians, but we don't really have a technical cadre, and I think we probably need one. So the third thing that I would say is, in the third recommendation that I have, is transparency and accounting for gaps in commitments around the world. And what I mean by that is that we now have a situation where post-Ebola, a bunch of countries, including our own, made a lot of commitments to do better themselves, to help others, to do work in their regions. And making sure that there is a mutual accountability framework for that is really important, to track who's doing what and whether they're living up to what they said that they were going to do in a positive way. In addition to that, while we also have external evaluations now being implemented by the WHO, which are actually going relatively well, 70 countries have done them. Most countries, not all countries, will do them. They're voluntary. And we do think that there should be a global accounting for all countries and how they're actually doing on health security. And so we are developing a global health security index with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Open Philanthropy Project, which will include all countries, we hope, and we'll be able to track on a regular basis how countries are doing. I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But in the interest of time, I'll move to my last recommendation, which gets at some elements that were discussed on the last panel as well. So disease surveillance has long been a focus of our work, not only domestically, but abroad. And when you look at the intersection of our need to detect threats early and where technology is going to help us do that, the ability to gain information real time, analyze it, and share it are still barriers. And there are many reasons why there are barriers in those different component parts, but putting a very concerted global focus on figuring out what each of those barriers are to sharing information, to analyzing it, and to utilizing it in real time, I think would be a huge service, and it will take a very large decadal project, in my view, to be able to do that well. And I'll just leave you with this. Biological threats are one of the only species-ending potential threats that we have in the world to face. And so focusing on global catastrophic biological risks is important in our ability to detect novel, emerging, changed, and modified threats, whether naturally occurring, intentional, or deliberate, is critical, and we're not where we need to be. So thanks for your emphasis on this.
Thank you. That's a big way to end. It gives us some sense of responsibility to sustain the species. But you're right. I know that some of my colleagues have to leave pretty soon. I wonder if you want to ask some last questions, Donna or Ken, before you have to go.
Yeah, just a point about the management of crises, because you'll remember that that organization they put together with USAID's unit in the lead was, in fact, replaced by the president appointing the former chief of staff for the vice president to coordinate it, which reinforces our view that major crises have to be managed out of the White House and perhaps out of the vice president's office. It requires not just the management skills and a clear decision about who the lead is, but I think a force of personality that can get people to work together, but also that has the support of the White House, of the president and the vice president in particular. These are tricky issues. or the person has direct access to the president, as James Lilly Witt did, the FEMA director during the Clinton administration. We all worked for him. I mean, there was no question in my people's mind when we were dealing with Andrew, for example, that everybody worked for him, and he could get the president directly on the phone. But it was well coordinated. It certainly wasn't an Ebola outbreak. And my second point would be, we can work out the management. Most presidents, when they hire people, do not ask the question, have you had any management experience? That's the other problem here. And so if you don't have a series of people that have access to the president, that have had extensive management experience, you really are flying around trying to figure out. And I always felt badly for the CDC because they weren't organized to manage a big crisis. They were organized to give advice, to be really the consultants, to be the scientists that would give advice. They had very well-trained people, but they're not a line organization in the traditional sense. The local county health administrators are more line administrators, as are the state people. They don't have a series of people they can order around that can implement an overall strategy. But they certainly have to be there because they're critical to getting the science right and getting the facts right as part of that. So my great worry is that we don't think about the management skills as we're appointing people across the board for some of these critical appointments, and we're going to need to if we're going to be managing these things in the future.
Just add a couple of comments. I agree with most of what you said, Dr. Shalala, but I learned painfully, because I had no background in emergency response when I started as OFDA director in 1989. I was giving the field orders, even though I'd never been to the country, when we sent out DART teams, and I learned that all the decisions I was making were stupid decisions, because I was not there. They were there, they were watching what was happening, they were recommending to me, and I learned what I had to do was to support them. My job was to get everyone else out of their way so they get their job done. If they needed more resources, more staff, more money, I could get them, and manage the politics with the Hill. I'll tell you one quick story. I had 5 members of Congress, since I was a former legislator, senators, I'm not being critical of legislators, call me up yelling at me because on the front page of the Washington Post during the Kurdish emergency, when those million Kurds went up after the first Gulf War into Turkey because Saddam's people were massacring them, there is a meningitis epidemic. How come you're not immunizing all the children? We had a CDC doctor from Mike Toole from Australia, very famous guy. He was on the team. He said, Andrew, there is no meningitis epidemic. The Washington Post reporter knows nothing. He's not a medical doctor. And I said, Michael, if you tell me there's no, then there is no epidemic. So I yelled actually at the staffs in Congress. And I said, since when are we taking the Washington Post as a source of information of what's happening on the ground? When you have a natural immunity, you don't, which the Kurds do. The Kurds have natural immunity to meningitis. You do not immunize all the adults because you break down their natural immunity. He said it's stupid to do that. In fact, it's counterproductive. So I said, my job is to protect you, Michael, and the DART team from having people in Congress or the news media or the White House beating you up for doing something that you shouldn't be doing. And I learned very early on
That's exactly what happened in Ebola in
Yes.
West Africa. Once they got the resources, they were making decisions on the ground.
right, that's the best way to do it.
Tom?
Well, Joe, I just first of all thank all of our experts today. I think this has just been an extraordinary day, and the presentations have just been consistently extraordinarily informative. Andrew, I think you've sensitized me to the word coordination. I think that's fitting. I would say, though, I think we have to be cognizant of the importance of semantics, and we have to come up with words that describe what it is we need to do. And it seems to me we have to tear down the silos. We have to create far greater managerial authority and responsibility. And I like your delegation of responsibility to the lowest levels. But somehow all of that is needed. And I don't know that implementation in and of itself fits. I mean, I could see independent implementation that would be counterproductive and actually create more problems without some degree of effort of understanding how you bring all of the entities together to create more of a unified force going forward. And I take your point about coordination, and we overuse it. Oftentimes, excessive bureaucracy is a result of too much coordination, and that's your point. But I think we still have to be cognizant of the need to do a lot better job of bringing the entities together than we do today.
Well, just to add, in 2003, we assigned for the first time permanently senior foreign service officers to all the regional combatant commands, and they're still there. Not the same officers, we rotate them, but they're permanently at the headquarters, and they do actual exercises with the military, and they become friends with them, and they trust each other. I will not mention who it was, but during a major emergency before I was aid administrator, I remember a Marine four-star general saying, maybe I shouldn't say this, I won't say it in public, but he said some very derogatory remarks about humanitarians. And I said, General, it's very easy for you in the field with tanks and weapons, and I'm a former military officer, to go into a war zone. You know, our people don't have guns when we go in. The real heroes are the aid workers from AID and the United Nations and the NGOs and the ICRC that go in without any protection, at risk, into a war zone. So don't make any comments about who's tougher, okay? So he apologized, but no one says that now in the regional combatant commands because they realize what the AID culture is, that they're very brave people in these agencies to do that kind of work. Why is that the case? Because they actually train together. And one of the emergency response principles is work the exercise. They keep saying that. Write the exercise down together as a group and then work it. And once you start seeing how the thing actually works, how the NGOs work, how the AID, Office of Foreign Disaster, how the ECHO office in the European Union, which is like OFDA, and how the ICR, and then you understand how these pieces all fit together. But you don't do it intellectually. You do it when you actually work the exercises. You actually have tabletop exercises, then field training exercises. That's the way you coordinate, to use an abused term.
Yeah, I appreciate Tom's question because I wanted to clarify the difference between our support and yours of the Office of the Vice President to be the leader and your concern that coordination can slow things up. So I take it you're distinguishing between coordination and leadership.
Distinction between preparing before the event.
Yeah.
That's what we do need coordination then.
Right.
We need the vice president, but we do not have the vice president giving orders to the teams in the field. I don't care who the person is. That's the difference. Once the emergency takes place, you trust the people who who've trained together, who know what they're doing, who've done this over and over again, who have standard operating procedures. You don't want, for example, during a war, having people in the White House, any White House, giving orders to battalion commanders in the field about how they're supposed to be fighting the war. That's why we have military officers.
As part of that preparation, roles have been assigned so people aren't overlapping each other wastefully or getting in each other's way. Dr. Dowell, I wanted to ask you this question. A few years ago, I was at the Munich Security Conference, and Bill Gates was there. Gave a great talk about the, take care, folks, about the bio threats. And I felt really, I'd already started, I felt really, encouraged by his interest. And I've seen every now and then he's spoken again about it. Has the Gates Foundation actually supported programs that deal with the bio threat?
He has continued to prioritize this, and in fact is giving the Shattuck lecture day after tomorrow at the Massachusetts Medical Society, focused on epidemic innovations that are needed. So it's top of mind for him. And the foundation has, in a series of responses, sort of backed into engaging on epidemic preparedness. So it has not been a priority for the Gates Foundation historically. We got into it with Ebola in a smaller way, again with Zika, and now we have a small strategy around epidemic preparedness coordination that we're making modest investments in. So I think the answer is yes, and also that we recognize that the major job of health security, as with all security, is a government function, and that we will never displace the role of governments in doing that function.
Agreed. But there is a really important role to play. Actually, he's playing it by speaking out because it educates people. Dr. Billy, you know, I saw you do something that's rarely done in Washington. You gave your microphone to someone else. This is really very rare. And you, as a full-fledged and quite distinguished veterinarian, do you want to, you talked to me during one of the breaks about the zoonotic effect. Do you want to have the last word on some of the testimony today and the way it validated our concern about zoonotic effects?
Thank you, Senator. I was going to say yes, and I'm a doctor, but I actually know how to implement, so that's why I handed you the microphone. Yes, I am supposed to. I was my responsibility to mention something about zoonotic diseases in One Health, but I'm not going to. And I don't think we have time for questions, but we would love to be able to follow up with you and the previous speakers to get some information that we can use for the report. And I'm going to use this principle, and I think all of you have referred to it, but, you know, kind of a management principle, you know, good leadership, and you have to know when to lead, and sometimes you need to know when to follow, and also you have to know when to kind of get out of the way. And I think all of you have been talking, now all of you are in the private sector, which is a great timing, and some of our other speakers. And so we can only make so many demands of government, but we also can make some suggestions on how government can facilitate other actors to work well. So I'd like for us to be able to follow up with you and start thinking about that, about what the federal government can do, because that's kind of our audience who we're aiming for, but what also can they do or don't need to do that would make this world a better place and a safer place? How could they facilitate that? How can they make the private sector more effective or more engaged, where they can help, those kinds of things. So I'd love to, if we could follow up with all of our speakers today there.
Excellent. That obviates the need for a closing statement by me. I want to thank this panel and everybody who's been here for your interest in this problem, this threat, and our work on it. It's been, for me, a very helpful and constructive day, and I thank you for that. We are now officially adjourned. Have a good day.